Have you ever laughed at the roles of this legendary comedian? After this video, you won't be able to laugh anymore. Under the guise of Hollywood's secular saint is a chilling manipulator, insistently forcing an actress to use a massage device in front of a crowd of emotionless men, wearing a clown suit, frantically screaming and humiliating her in the middle of a Manhattan intersection, in front of 300 silent people. He even directed his terrifying aggression toward a young junior cast member. After all, how long has Hollywood tolerated a devil in exchange for laughter? Let's walk through exactly how this dark reality played out, starting from the very first moments of pre-production for the 1990 film Quick Change. Geena Davis had just won an Academy Award. She was a highly respected actress, walking into what she believed would be a standard casting meeting. But this initial introduction did not take place inside a normal studio office building. It did not happen in a brightly lit room with casting assistants. The location chosen for this meeting was a private, secluded hotel suite. Geena walked through the door, and it was firmly closed behind her. Inside this isolated space, she found herself alone with 3 men. There was the co-director, a producer, and the undisputed star and creative force of the project, Bill Murray. Usually, a meeting like this is straightforward. You sit down, open the script, and read the dialogue to test your on-screen chemistry. But there were no scripts open that day. Almost immediately, Bill Murray derailed the professional environment. He brought out a mechanical device called the thumper. I need to be clear about this object. It was not a small handheld item. The thumper is a heavy-duty chiropractic massager. It is a bulky machine with a thick power cord, and when turned on, it vibrates violently and creates a loud humming noise. It is undeniably not an item that belongs in any kind of professional workplace meeting. Bill Murray pointed directly to the hotel bed. He looked at an Academy Award-winning actress and instructed her to lie down on the mattress. He told her he was going to use this heavy massager on her body right then and there, in full view of the 2 other male executives. Geena Davis immediately said no. She was deeply uncomfortable, and she firmly refused his demand. In any normal professional environment, that is where the interaction ends. If someone says no, you pack the device away and get back to the actual work. But Bill Murray ignored her refusal. He refused to take no for an answer. He started relentlessly badgering her. He kept pushing, telling her to just get on the bed and let him use the machine. Geena kept saying no, trying to maintain her professional boundaries while trapped in this intimidating setup. The verbal pressure continued to build until he shattered the physical boundary between them. He closed the distance, walked right up to her, turned the heavy vibrating machine on, and forcefully pressed it onto her back. He ignored her clear verbal rejections, used his physical presence to overpower her, and forced this device onto her body. He established his absolute dominance before a single camera was ever turned on. Now, let us move forward to the actual filming of the movie. The production moved out of that quiet hotel room and directly onto the busy, chaotic streets of New York City. A major film set in Manhattan is an immense logistical operation. There are giant grip trucks blocking the avenues, diesel generators roaring, and heavy barricades set up to hold back the local traffic. It is an intense, high-stress environment where every single minute costs the studio thousands of dollars. For this location shoot, there were over 300 crew members, lighting technicians, and background extras swarming the intersection. During this setup, Geena Davis was sitting inside her private production trailer. She was strictly following the daily schedule, waiting inside for the wardrobe department to arrive and finalize her costume for the upcoming scene. Suddenly, the heavy metal door of her trailer was violently thrown open. Bill Murray stormed into her small, confined space. The visual picture of this moment is incredibly surreal and terrifying because he was wearing his full costume for the scene. He was dressed as a bank-robbing clown. He was wearing baggy ruffles, thick white face paint, and a bright red clown nose. But there was nothing funny about his energy. The colorful comedic costume contrasted wildly with the sheer unhinged rage on his face. He did not ask her why she was still in the trailer. He did not use a radio to communicate with the wardrobe team. He just immediately started screaming at her. He unleashed an aggressive wave of vicious verbal abuse. He was swearing at her, using intense profanity and yelling at the top of his lungs. He used his physical size to trap her inside the narrow hallway of the trailer, leaning his body forward and screaming directly into her face. He aggressively ordered her to get out of the trailer right that second. Geena was shocked and terrified. She rushed out of the door and hurried down the metal steps onto the busy New York asphalt. But the terrifying attack did not stop inside the trailer. The abuse spilled directly out into the public daylight. Geena started walking rapidly down the crowded Manhattan sidewalk, trying to get to the filming location and escape his wrath. Bill Murray chased right after her. He did not stop screaming for a single second. He stayed exactly one step behind her back, leaning his upper body forward so that his painted face was right next to her ear. He walked behind her, screaming horrific insults and swearing at her at maximum volume. His voice cut right through the heavy noise of the city traffic. And as he followed her through this maze of heavy electrical cables and lighting stands, he escalated the humiliation even further. While walking right behind her, he reached out and intentionally tugged at her bra strap. He physically grabbed her undergarments in the middle of a crowded intersection. He was publicly degrading her, invading her physical space, and screaming aggressively into her ear, all while wearing a clown suit. He did all of this intentionally, creating a humiliating public spectacle directly in front of the 300 crew members and extras standing on that street. We need to look past the surface of these horrifying events and decode the psychological warfare operating behind the scenes. We have to ask the most difficult, chilling questions about human nature and corporate complicity. Why would a universally adored, incredibly wealthy movie star risk his entire reputation to pull a bizarre stunt with a heavy mechanical device? And even more disturbingly, how could hundreds of working professionals watch a blatant display of psychological and physical harassment and do nothing to stop it? This is the exact moment where the story transitions from the isolated actions of a single hostile actor into a terrifying autopsy of a broken, toxic industry system. It is very easy for the general public to look at that initial hotel room interaction and mislabel it. People often try to rationalize inappropriate behavior from famous comedians. They try to frame it as a strange, misguided joke gone wrong. They try to excuse it as the eccentric, unpredictable behavior of a creative genius who just lacks normal social filters. But years after the incident, Geena Davis provided a much darker, much more clinical, and accurate psychological evaluation of that moment. She theorized that forcing the massager onto her body had nothing to do with physical relaxation, and it was not even strictly about sexual gratification. It was something much more insidious. It was a pure, deliberate power play. You have to analyze the mindset of a predator operating within a highly competitive, hierarchical environment. When you hold all the financial and creative cards on a multi-million-dollar film project, How do you ensure absolute, unquestioning compliance from your subordinates? You test their personal boundaries on the very first day. You present them with a demand that is unreasonable, unprofessional, and deeply uncomfortable. You create a scenario where the request is just absurd enough that the victim might hesitate to immediately report it to human resources. He was actively testing the waters of her compliance. He wanted to see if he could break her professional will. If he could successfully force a highly respected Academy Award-winning actress to submit to a degrading physical act within the first 10 minutes of meeting her, he would establish total psychological dominance for the remainder of the production schedule. It was not a casting audition. It was an obedience test. He was attempting to attach a psychological leash to his co-star. He was proving with terrifying clarity that his sudden, bizarre whim was vastly more important than her basic human dignity and her right to a safe workplace. Furthermore, he exploited his background in improvisational comedy to mask this abuse. This is a highly effective tactic used by predatory entertainers. He used the excuse of testing their on-screen chemistry to cover up his psychological control. He disguised a hostile boundary violation as an acting exercise. This traps the victim in a devastating lose-lose psychological paradox. If she complies with the insane demand, she degrades herself and surrenders her bodily autonomy. If she violently refuses and walks out of the room, he instantly flips the narrative. He gaslights her. He can easily look at the other men in the room and claim that she is simply too rigid, that she cannot handle spontaneous improvisation, and that she lacks a basic sense of humor. He uses his comedy credentials to transform a legitimate victim into a difficult, humorless diva in the eyes of the production team. But the calculated behavior of the predator is only half of this horrifying equation. We have to shine a massive, uncomfortable spotlight on the enablers. We have to look at the other individuals in that locked hotel suite. There was a co-director and a producer sitting right there in the room while the actress was being cornered and physically pressured. Their contractual job description is to manage the daily production, protect the cast, and ensure a legally compliant, safe working environment. Yet, as a woman firmly said no and was forced into physical contact with a mechanical device against her will, those two men did not utter a single syllable. They did not stand up. They did not intervene. They sat in their chairs like frozen, silent statues. Why did they stay quiet? Because in the brutal ecosystem of Hollywood, moral courage is rarely rewarded. But protecting the financial asset is the ultimate directive. The lead actor was the golden goose. He was the sole reason the movie secured studio financing. He was the reason those producers had their high-paying jobs. So, they made a calculated, sickening, silent choice in that room. They eagerly traded her physical and psychological safety for their own financial security. They decided that keeping their temperamental, powerful star happy was vastly more important than protecting a woman from a blatant assault. Their silence was not merely passive cowardice. It was active, undeniable complicity. By refusing to intervene, they validated the abuser. They handed him a blank check. They sent a loud, clear message that he was untouchable, and they sent a devastating message to the actress that she was entirely on her own. This exact same toxic dynamic amplified to a terrifying, almost unbelievable degree when the production moved outside onto the streets of New York. It is deeply disturbing when two men turn a blind eye in a private, locked room. It is an entirely different level of societal failure when 300 people watch an abuse happen in broad daylight and no one steps forward. We have to deeply analyze the bystander effect. This is a documented psychological phenomenon where individuals in a large crowd are significantly less likely to offer help to a victim. The sense of personal responsibility diffuses among the group. Everyone assumes that someone else will surely step in. Everyone assumes that because no one else is panicking or calling for the police, the situation must not actually be a real emergency. But on a major film set, the standard bystander effect is weaponized and multiplied by a strict, unforgiving corporate hierarchy. An American movie set does not operate as a democracy. It operates as a strict military dictatorship. At the very top of the pyramid, you have the A-list star, the director, and the studio executives. At the very bottom, you have the production assistants, the background extras, the lighting technicians, and the grip crew. The people at the bottom are highly skilled, but they are considered entirely replaceable by the studio machine. If a working-class camera operator drops his equipment, steps in front of the lead actor, and tells him to stop screaming at his co-star, that crew member is not hailed as a hero. That crew member is fired before their next coffee break. They are permanently blacklisted from future studio projects. They lose their union health insurance. They are forever labeled in the industry as a liability who disrupts the shooting schedule. Therefore, when those 300 crew members watched that horrifying chase through the streets of Manhattan, they were paralyzed by systemic fear. They were watching their own paychecks. They were calculating their own survival. They saw a man at the peak of the Hollywood food chain doing whatever he wanted, and they knew with certainty that the billion-dollar studio system would protect the famous abuser, not the working-class crew member who tried to stop him. The deafening silence of that massive crowd did not happen because those 300 people were inherently evil or malicious. The silence happened because the American entertainment industry is specifically engineered to protect abusers who generate massive profit margins. There is also a deeply manipulative, highly effective element to the visual presentation of the public abuse. The abuser chose to execute his attack while wearing a ridiculous, brightly colored clown costume. This was not a coincidence. This adds a thick layer of psychological confusion to the bystanders. In the twisted, unpredictable world of a comedy film set, a famous man screaming at the top of his lungs in a clown suit can momentarily short-circuit the logical processing of the human brain. The observers are forced to second-guess their own eyes and ears. They wonder if they are witnessing a secret rehearsal. They wonder if it is an intense experimental method acting technique. They question if it is just the eccentric, chaotic genius of a beloved comedian getting into character for the next camera setup. This is the ultimate impenetrable shield for toxic behavior in the creative arts. For decades, modern society has been aggressively conditioned to accept the dangerous myth that brilliant artists are inherently difficult, erratic, or slightly abusive. We are taught to forgive the cruelty because we highly value the final piece of art. The massive crowd in New York City was deeply conditioned by this exact cultural myth. They were trained by the media to look at a terrifying public meltdown and label it as the quirky eccentricities of a comedy legend. The abuser is fully aware of this dynamic. He banks his entire reputation on this hesitation. He knows that his carefully crafted public persona, as the lovable, goofy, harmless guy from your favorite childhood movies, will act as an invisible, bulletproof force field. It prevents anyone from tackling him to the concrete when he blatantly steps out of line and terrorizes a woman. The silence of the observers is the invisible weapon that truly empowers the predator. The bizarre incident with the massage machine was the initial private test of submission. But the freezing silence of the massive crowd was the ultimate public confirmation of his unchecked power. He learned in that hotel room that he could trap a woman, and the executives would silently protect him. He learned on the streets of Manhattan that he could humiliate her publicly, and the working crew would simply look the other way. The true lingering horror of this entire ordeal is not merely the hostile actions of one unhinged, egotistical man. It is the chilling, stomach-turning realization that an entire industry, a culture of hundreds of people, will collectively choose to be blind, deaf, and mute just to keep the cameras rolling and the box office dollars flowing. The freezing silence of a massive film crew does not happen by accident. It is a highly conditioned response carefully engineered by a multi-billion-dollar public relations machine. To comprehend how an individual can operate with such tyrannical authority for decades, we have to look away from the specific incidents of hostility and deeply examine the protective fortress built around his public image. The American entertainment industry possesses a terrifying ability to take deeply toxic, abusive behavior and rebrand it for public consumption. The Hollywood system did not just hide his hostile actions behind closed doors. They actively normalized them. They took his cruelty, packaged it with a highly profitable comedic bow, and sold it to the global audience as a unique, lovable personality trait. For decades, the media constructed an impenetrable mythology around this specific comedian. They elevated him far beyond the status of a mere actor or entertainer. They transformed him into a Hollywood secular saint. We all know the legendary internet stories that constantly circulate in pop culture. He randomly shows up at a stranger's wedding, crashes the photos, and everyone laughs. He walks up to a random person in a fast food restaurant, eats one of their French fries, and whispers that no one will ever believe them. The American public devoured these whimsical urban legends. The media circulated these stories endlessly, framing him as a magical, almost mythical figure who operates outside the normal, restrictive rules of polite society. But this carefully curated image of the quirky, unpredictable trickster is not just innocent celebrity folklore. It is a highly effective, dangerous psychological shield. When you are universally branded by the media as a lovable eccentric, you are granted a terrifying level of social immunity. He weaponized his comedic charm to evade accountability for his actions. In the ruthless political hierarchy of Hollywood, humor is very often deployed as an aggressive defensive weapon. If a serious dramatic actor screams at a crew member, the industry might label them difficult, dangerous, or uninsurable. But if a legendary, beloved comedian does the exact same thing, the entire narrative shifts instantly. The victim of the abuse is suddenly placed on the defensive. If you complain about a beloved, funny man crossing a professional line, the industry machine immediately gaslights you. The executives tell you that you just do not understand his unique creative process. They tell you that you are taking things way too seriously. They systematically brand the victim as a humorless buzzkill who is actively ruining the fun and the creative vibe for everyone else on the project. This is the dark, insidious nature of weaponized laughter. He discovered very early in his lucrative career that as long as he maintained the baseline public persona of the funny, laid-back guy, he could get away with psychological murder behind the scenes. He used the cultural currency of his comedy to purchase silence from the people he targeted. The studios knew exactly who he was when the cameras stopped rolling. The high-level executives knew all about the explosive screaming matches, the severe intimidation tactics, and the blatant boundary violations. But they also looked at the massive guaranteed box office returns. They looked at the cultural adoration and the skyrocketing merchandise sales. And They made a collective, industry-wide, deeply cynical decision to protect the revenue stream at the direct expense of workplace safety. The most disturbing aspect of this decades-long cover-up is not the corporate studio protection. Corporate greed is predictable. The truly horrifying element is the active vocal complicity of his famous friends and highly respected colleagues. To maintain the profitable illusion of the lovable eccentric, the industry relies on a tight network of powerful enablers who are willing to publicly reframe his abuse for the press. Look closely at the specific language used by prominent Hollywood figures when discussing his notorious on-set behavior. The legendary director Frank Oz, who worked closely with him on major studio projects, did not call out the toxic environment. He did not use accurate legal words like harassment, bullying, or workplace abuse. Instead, Frank Oz publicly described the actor as a creative force who was simply lacking boundaries. We need to deconstruct that specific phrase because it is incredibly dangerous. Calling a grown, powerful, incredibly wealthy man lacking boundaries is a masterclass in corporate Hollywood spin. It sounds almost endearing to the general public. It sounds like the gentle description of an overeager puppy or a passionate, misunderstood artist who just cares too much about his craft. It removes the malicious intent from the equation. When you say someone lacks boundaries, you are subtly implying that they just do not know any better. You are stripping away their adult agency and their moral responsibility. But a man aggressively intimidating female co-stars does not simply lack boundaries. He actively, intentionally chooses to destroy the boundaries of others, to establish his own dominance. The Hollywood establishment used gentle, artistic, pseudo-intellectual terminology to sanitize aggressive, predatory behavior. Another staggering, deeply revealing example of this toxic rebranding comes directly from his legendary comedic peer, Dan Aykroyd. Aykroyd famously coined a catchy nickname to describe his friend's explosive, unpredictable temper tantrums on set. He affectionately dubbed these hostile outbursts the Hurricane. This is perhaps the most dangerous piece of Hollywood public relations in this entire dark saga. Think deeply about the psychological implication of naming a man's violent temper after a devastating natural disaster. A hurricane is a massive, uncontrollable act of God. It is a blind force of nature. You cannot reason with a hurricane. You cannot negotiate with it. Most importantly, you cannot hold a hurricane legally or morally accountable for the destruction it causes. You just have to board up your windows, hunker down in the dark, survive the storm, and clean up the wreckage after it eventually passes. By branding his highly abusive behavior as the Hurricane, his inner circle of elite Hollywood friends removed his human accountability. They transformed a deliberate, conscious, cruel choice to terrorize coworkers into an uncontrollable, mythical weather event. His rage became a legendary, quirky piece of industry trivia instead of a human resources violation. A terrified crew member telling a story about surviving the hurricane became a twisted badge of honor, a fun, exciting anecdote to share at exclusive Hollywood dinner parties. This nickname erases the actual victims from the narrative. It turns the very real, lasting trauma of the people he targeted into a catchy punchline. It signals to the entire industry that his outbursts are not fireable offenses. They are just part of the exciting, unpredictable experience of working with a certified comedy genius. This relentless normalization speaks to a much larger, deeply toxic habit within the American media landscape. American culture possesses a dangerous obsession with idolizing the eccentric, difficult male genius. The media loves the romantic narrative of the tortured artist who plays by his own rules and defies corporate structure. We are culturally conditioned to believe that true, brilliant art requires a certain level of madness, cruelty, or dysfunction. Hollywood actively exploits this cultural blind spot to maximize their profits. They know that the public will readily hand out endless get-out-of-jail-free cards to men who make them laugh. The industry treats these comedic icons like untouchable modern royalty, granting them diplomatic immunity from standard workplace ethics. The overarching philosophy of the studio system is horrifyingly simple. If you generate enough money, win enough awards, and provide enough entertainment to the masses, the rules of basic human decency simply do not apply to your existence. But the carefully constructed, profitable facade of the lovable trickster eventually met a wall it could not charm its way out of. The narrative of the quirky genius falls apart when subjected to the cold, clinical light of the actual victim's lived experiences. The people who were trapped in rooms with him, the people who were screamed at in public, do not view him as a secular saint, a hilarious prankster, or a natural disaster. Geena Davis shattered the industry's protective mythology by explicitly reframing his behavior for exactly what it truly was. She bravely stripped away the protective comedy defense. She rejected the gentle, enabling labels of lacking boundaries or the Hurricane. She laid out a clear, undeniable truth that the Hollywood machine spent 30 years trying to bury under piles of cash and good publicity. This was not a quirky personality trait. This was not a passionate artistic dedication to the unpredictable craft of improvisational comedy. This was targeted, systematic, relentless bullying. This was the calculated abuse of power by a man who knew exactly how much psychological damage he could inflict without ever facing a single consequence from his employers. Calling his actions a comedic style is a gross, unforgivable insult to the victims who had to silently endure his tyranny to keep their careers alive. It is a deliberate lie told by an industry desperate to protect its most valuable, highest-earning assets. When we allow a culture to successfully disguise cruelty as comedy, we all become complicit in the abuse. The Hollywood machine spent decades convincing the American public that a volatile monster was actually just a harmless, lovable mascot. They used the sound of our own laughter in the movie theaters to drown out the terrified silence of the people he intimidated on set. They weaponized his natural charm to build an impenetrable fortress around a bully, proving that in the ruthless American entertainment industry, a truly great punchline is very often the perfect cover for a terrible crime. Stop making excuses for Hollywood celebrities. Stop blaming the extreme stress of a movie set. If you still believe that a comedian acting violently is just a rare, isolated mistake, you need to wake up immediately. The horrifying behavior we just discussed was not a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a terrifying, decades-long pattern. This man left a documented trail of broken colleagues and traumatized victims in his wake. He did not care about your age. He did not care about your gender. He did not care about your professional status. If you crossed his path, he used his immense fame and his physical size to destroy you. We are going to look directly at his actual track record of physical violence. We are going to expose the endless chain of victims, starting with the most sickening, undeniable proof that this Hollywood superstar possessed zero basic human empathy. Let's look at exactly what he did to a defenseless junior cast member. Let us rewind the timeline to a television set involving a young actor named Seth Green. Seth Green was just a young junior cast member at the time of this terrifying encounter. I want you to visualize the extreme physical power dynamic playing out in this room. You have a wealthy, highly influential adult Hollywood star towering over a small young actor, a rookie who is simply trying to navigate an intimidating, fast-paced professional environment. According to the direct accounts from the set, the young actor was just being a typical kid. He was sitting a bit too close to the craft services table where the famous actors get their food. A normal adult in any functioning society would simply use their words. They would ask the junior cast member to politely move out of the way. They would call for a production assistant to find the boy's guardians. That is not how this comedian operates. He did not use his words to solve a minor annoyance. He immediately resorted to extreme physical violence. He walked right up to this young junior cast member, grabbed him forcefully by his ankles, and physically lifted his entire body off the floor. He dangled a terrified, helpless rookie upside down in the air, and then he violently dropped him straight into a nearby garbage can. Think about the sheer psychological terror inflicted on a young actor in that exact moment. A grown man using his physical advantage to humiliate and physically assault a vulnerable co-star in front of a room full of working adults. The young actor was left crying, deeply confused and terrified. And yet again, the industry adults in the room just watched it happen in stunned silence. This proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that his predatory behavior has no limits. You might try to rationalize this nightmare and think maybe it was a bizarre anomaly. But the ugly truth is that the extreme toxicity was baked into his professional reputation from the very beginning of his television career. Let us examine the gold standard of American television comedy, Saturday Night Live. The backstage area of Studio 8H in New York City is famous for being a high-pressure, competitive environment, but it is fundamentally supposed to be a collaborative ensemble of artists working closely together to create a live nationwide broadcast. Instead, he turned the backstage hallways of that iconic television studio into a toxic war zone. The most infamous moment of this early era was the violent physical altercation with his former castmate, Chevy Chase. This was not a minor passive-aggressive disagreement over a comedy script. It was not a heated vocal argument during a writer's meeting. It escalated into a brutal, full-blown physical fistfight right outside the dressing rooms. John Belushi and other cast members literally had to physically jump between them to pull them apart. They were throwing actual heavy punches, trying to physically injure each other just moments before the live television cameras started rolling for millions of viewers. He carried that seething, toxic anger for decades. When he finally returned to host Saturday Night Live years later in 1993, the cast members from that specific era reported that the atmosphere was suffocating. They described him as a man who was practically vibrating with rage. He was openly hostile, absolutely hating the new cast, and he made sure that every single person in that building felt his boiling resentment. The cast members were terrified to even walk down the same hallway as him. He created an environment of pure fear in a place that relies entirely on creative freedom and laughter. But the violence was not just limited to cramped television studios in New York. Let us move forward to the production of the massive blockbuster hit movie What About Bob? This is a universally beloved film. Millions of families watch it and laugh at the hilarious, seemingly harmless dynamic between the quirky patient and his uptight psychiatrist. But the real insanity was happening the second the director yelled, "Cut." His co-star on this major studio project was Richard Dreyfuss. Dreyfuss was not a random background extra. He was a highly respected veteran leading man in Hollywood. But that elite industry status offered him zero protection from the wrath of his co-star. During one intense argument on location, he lost his temper. He marched right up to Richard Dreyfuss, leaned aggressively into his face, and screamed at the top of his lungs. He looked his co-star dead in the eye and yelled that everyone on the entire crew hated his guts. He used deeply personal, vicious verbal abuse to intentionally break his co-star's spirit and isolate him from the rest of the production team. He wanted Dreyfuss to feel alone, paranoid, and utterly despised in his own workplace. He wanted to mentally break him down before the cameras even started rolling for the day. But the severe verbal psychological torture was not enough to satisfy his rage. The argument escalated into a terrifying physical attack. He picked up a heavy glass ashtray from a nearby table. This was not a light breakaway plastic movie prop designed for a stunt. It was a solid, thick piece of heavy glass weighing over half a kilo. He pulled his arm back and hurled it directly at Richard Dreyfuss's face with maximum force. The heavy glass object missed his head by mere inches and shattered violently against the wall. If that heavy projectile had actually connected with its intended target, it would have caused severe facial trauma, a massive hospital visit, or permanent injury. It was a blatant, highly dangerous physical assault with a blunt weapon. And how did he respond when reporters boldly asked him about this horrifying incident years later? He denied the severity of the attack, but he did so by offering a chilling sociopathic threat disguised as a joke. He publicly stated with a straight face that if he had actually meant to throw the glass ashtray at him, he would not have missed. I want you to really absorb the darkness of that statement. He refuses to offer a single apology. He refuses to take any basic accountability for throwing a heavy weapon at a coworker. Instead, he publicly brags about his aim and casually threatens the victim all over again in the national press. The rampage on that exact same movie set did not stop with his male co-star. He also brutally targeted the film's producer, a highly successful woman named Laura Ziskin. A producer is technically his boss. She is the executive managing the studio budget, keeping the shooting schedule on track, and ensuring the safety of the entire crew. During a heated disagreement about the production schedule, he did not sit down and negotiate like a professional adult. He weaponized his physical size once again. He grabbed the female producer and violently threw her body directly into a lake on the property. When she managed to drag herself out of the water, he followed it up with aggressive, terrifying verbal threats. He physically assaulted the female executive running the entire production, and he suffered zero consequences. The studio executives heard about it. They looked at the daily footage. They saw that the comedy scenes were hilarious, and they buried the assault. They decided that a wet, traumatized female producer was simply the acceptable cost of doing business. This endless chain of toxic behavior did not just ruin professional working relationships. It destroyed his closest, most valuable personal connections. Harold Ramis was his longtime creative partner, his closest personal friend, and the brilliant director responsible for his biggest iconic career hits, like Groundhog Day. They built a massive comedy empire together from the ground up, but during the filming of that exact movie, they had a massive creative conflict. Instead of acting like a professional and resolving it, he shattered their decades-long friendship in an instant. For over 20 years, he stubbornly refused to speak a single word to the man who literally helped build his entire career. He cut him off completely, holding a bitter, deeply petty grudge. He maintained this icy, cruel silence until Harold Ramis was literally on his deathbed. It perfectly illustrates a deeply rooted fundamental inability to forgive, compromise, or maintain healthy human connections. He operates entirely on a system of domination, vicious grudges, and physical intimidation. This is not a quirky list of funny Hollywood anecdotes. This is a terrifying, undeniable rap sheet of a man who used his immense fame to physically and psychologically terrorize men, women, and even junior cast members for over 30 years. That 30-year rap sheet of relentless intimidation leaves behind something far more devastating than just ruined production schedules or tense press junkets. It leaves a deep, invisible, permanent psychological scar on the people who were forced to endure it in complete silence. To truly grasp the dark reality of this Hollywood dynamic, we have to slow down completely. We need to step away from the explosive anger of the abuser and look directly at the quiet, internal devastation of the target. We have to analyze the profound psychological contrast between two very different women from two very different eras of Hollywood who face the exact same monster. When we look back at Geena Davis, we have to understand the crushing internal weight she carried for decades. It is incredibly easy for the general public sitting at home to judge the situation in hindsight. It is easy to ask why she did not just scream for help. Why did she not just yell at him to stop? Why did she not walk off the set and call her lawyers? But those questions ignore the complex, paralyzing reality of being a working woman in the 1990s entertainment machine. Society conditions young girls from a very early age to be accommodating. They are actively taught to be polite, to smooth over awkward situations, and to never, ever make a public scene. In the high-stakes ecosystem of Hollywood, this deeply ingrained conditioning is multiplied by 1,000,000. If a woman in the 90s spoke up against a powerful male star, she was not hailed as a hero. She was immediately blacklisted. She was labeled as difficult, crazy, or impossible to work with. Her career would be over before the sun went down. So when faced with his overwhelming, terrifying hostility, her primary biological and professional survival instinct was not to fight back. Her instinct was to completely freeze. She tried to navigate the madness with extreme politeness, because that was literally the only defense mechanism the industry allowed her to possess. But this forced compliance created a secondary, far more insidious layer of trauma. Geena Davis did not just suffer from the initial mistreatment by her co-star, she suffered from a profound, suffocating sense of personal shame. For years after the cameras stopped rolling, she carried a heavy, silent guilt. She felt deeply humiliated by her own timidity. She constantly replayed those horrifying moments in her head, torturing herself over her inability to find her voice in that locked hotel room and on that crowded Manhattan street. She felt entirely powerless. The tragedy of her silence is that the victim ended up absorbing the crushing guilt that rightfully belonged to the aggressor. She blamed herself for not being brave enough to stop him, while the man who actually caused the immense pain walked away with millions of dollars in universal cultural adoration. This is the ultimate sickening trap of a toxic power dynamic. It systematically convinces the target that their polite paralysis is actually a massive personal failure. She was essentially dying of politeness. She was trapped in a psychological prison built by a culture that demanded her unwavering compliance. A seasoned Hollywood predator can instantly smell that ingrained politeness. They recognize it as a glaring vulnerability they can easily exploit. He knew with certainty that she would rather endure intense personal discomfort than cause a massive public disruption on his movie set. He banked his entire intimidation strategy on her good manners. The psychological toll of realizing that your own fundamental kindness was weaponized against you is devastating. She spent decades mourning the fierce vocal reaction she desperately wishes she had delivered. Her silence was never consent. It was a desperate survival mechanism that slowly ate away at her own self-esteem in the dark. But the culture of the American film industry is not entirely static. The unquestioned dominance of the old school, tyrannical leading man slowly began to face a completely different kind of energy as the industry transitioned into a new millennium. The year 2000 marked a massive, undeniable shift in the cultural landscape. It brought forward a brand new generation of fierce women who were no longer willing to silently absorb the toxicity of their predecessors. They did not subscribe to the outdated, suffocating mandate of constant shrinking politeness. This monumental generational shift collided directly with his outdated operating system on the set of the massive blockbuster action movie Charlie's Angels. The dynamic on this specific set was entirely different from his previous projects. He was no longer the undisputed king, holding all the creative and directorial power. He was an older actor hired to play a supporting role behind three incredibly powerful, highly bankable female leads, but his deeply ingrained habit of dominating the room through fear remained unchanged. During a standard cast rehearsal on the soundstage, a script rewrite was introduced by the creative team. He did not like the dialogue changes. Instead of having a professional, mature, creative discussion with the writers or the director, he immediately reverted to his classic, deeply toxic playbook. He bypassed the people responsible for the script and singled out one specific target to verbally decimate. He locked his sights directly on Lucy Liu. He unleashed a sudden, unprovoked barrage of deeply personal, viciously insulting language directly at her face. The words he used were later described by multiple witnesses in the room as inexcusable and deeply offensive. It was the exact same heavy-handed intimidation tactic he had successfully used for decades to silence his co-stars and establish his dominance over the production. He expected the exact same reaction he always received. He fully expected the young actress to lower her head, absorb the vicious verbal blows, apologize for something she did not even do, and quietly walk back to her trailer in tears. He expected the rest of the room to freeze in that familiar, terrifying, enabling silence. He demanded total submission. But Lucy Liu did not freeze. She did not shrink her physical presence to make him more comfortable. She flipped his established script and shattered his reality in a moment of pure, electrifying defiance. She stood her ground right there on the studio floor. She absolutely refused to internalize his projected shame. She did not let industry politeness dictate her reaction for a single second. She immediately fired back. She engaged him directly, fiercely defending her own dignity and her professional worth in front of the entire crew. When he hurled an inexcusable insult, she threw the verbal fire right back at him without missing a single beat. She adamantly refused to be a passive receptacle for his unwarranted egotistical rage. She told him exactly what she thought of his behavior, completely matching his volume and entirely destroying his momentum. The entire production crew watched the confrontation in absolute shock. But they were not shocked by his outburst, because his reputation was already legendary. They were shocked because someone finally had the supreme confidence to stand up, look the bully dead in the eye, and scream back. Lucy Liu dismantled his decades-long reign of terror in real time. She recognized his behavior instantly. She did not see a quirky eccentric or a passionate artist. She saw a pathetic, aging bully throwing a temper tantrum, and she made a rapid, conscious decision that she was not going to be another silent, traumatized footnote in his long history of unchecked hostility. She explicitly stated in interviews years later that she will never, ever choose to be silent when she is being attacked. She proved to the entire industry that the emperor actually had no clothes. His terrifying aura of absolute authority was dependent on the conditioned fear and the polite silence of his targets. The second a strong woman looked him directly in the eye, stood her ground, and refused to back down, his entire intimidation strategy collapsed on itself. The profound contrast between these two distinct psychological reactions is a stunning study in the evolution of workplace survival in Hollywood. Geena Davis represents the tragic, agonizing burden of the past. Her heartbreaking story is a crucial reminder of the silent, heavy emotional toll extracted by a systemic culture that demands female compliance above all else. She absorbed the poison so the production could survive, and she carried that heavy scar for 30 years. Lucy Liu represents the fierce, unapologetic, necessary resistance of the future. She represents the absolute refusal to ever sacrifice personal dignity for the sake of a movie or a famous ego. Her fiery retaliation on that soundstage was not just a personal victory. It was a loud, undeniable declaration that the era of dying of politeness was officially over. She showed the entire world that you do not have to carry the shame of a bully. You have the absolute right to throw it right back in their face. Lucy Liu's fierce defiance on that soundstage was a massive crack in the foundation. But the collapse of this untouchable Hollywood monument did not happen until the world finally caught up to his behavior. We have to jump all the way forward to the year 2022 to witness the final reckoning. The cultural landscape of America had completely shifted. The Me Too movement had fundamentally rewritten the rules of workplace conduct. The industry was different. The tolerance for abuse was gone. But Bill Murray was still operating on the exact same toxic software he used in the 90s. He genuinely believed his invisible force field of comedy was still active. He was cast in a major studio film titled Being Mortal. On this set, he reverted right back to his classic playbook. He targeted a junior production staffer. This was a woman significantly younger than him, occupying a much lower position on the corporate ladder. He decided to turn her body into a prop for his own amusement. He physically straddled the young woman and forced a kiss on her mouth. He expected the crew to laugh. He expected her to blush and brush it off as a wacky encounter with a Hollywood legend. But the year was 2022, and the silence of the bystanders had officially expired. In the past, the producers would have hidden the incident. They would have paid the victim off quietly and kept the cameras rolling. But modern corporate Hollywood is run by massive human resources departments and strict legal liabilities. Searchlight Pictures, the studio backing the film, did not hesitate for a single second. They did not care about his legacy or his iconic resume. They immediately shut the entire production down. They suspended the multi-million-dollar movie indefinitely. The untouchable star was suddenly very touchable. He was forced into a legal corner and had to pay a $100,000 settlement directly to the victim. And how did the legendary comedian respond to finally facing a real consequence? He went right to the press and tried to use his oldest, most reliable weapon. He tried to gaslight the entire public. He claimed he did something he thought was funny, and it just was not taken that way. He minimized a physical violation by calling it a simple miscommunication. He even had the sheer audacity to criticize the studio executives, implying the modern world had just gone crazy. He refused to admit that he did anything wrong. He still believed that his status as a comedy icon gave him a permanent free pass to cross physical boundaries. But the public was no longer buying the act. The quirky trickster routine was completely dead. Right as this massive 2022 scandal was dominating the news cycle, the final, most devastating blow was delivered. Geena Davis decided she was entirely done carrying the heavy, toxic weight of his secrets. She released her personal memoir, appropriately and painfully titled Dying of Politeness. She officially broke her 30-year silence. She bypassed the studio publicists and the enabling journalists. She put every horrifying detail of her experience into permanent print for the entire world to read. She reclaimed her own narrative. By writing the book, she refused to let his public relations team spin the story anymore. She explicitly laid out how he used his power to humiliate her, and more importantly, how the industry conditioned her to accept it. The release of Dying of Politeness was not just a celebrity tell-all. It was a cultural earthquake. Her immense bravery acted as a powerful beacon for every other person he had ever targeted. Once Geena Davis officially opened the floodgates, the dam completely broke. The fear of retaliation evaporated. Everyone else finally felt safe enough to speak their truth on the record. Lucy Liu publicly expanded on her terrifying confrontation. Seth Green finally felt comfortable sharing the deeply traumatic story of being thrown into a trash can. The isolated, terrified whispers of the 90s suddenly turned into a deafening, undeniable chorus of survivors in the modern era. The golden era of the untouchable Hollywood tyrant is officially over. The immense power of modern labor laws and corporate accountability finally outweighed the box office draw of a famous comedian. The thick protective curtain was pulled back forever. He is no longer viewed as the magical, lovable uncle of American cinema. He is finally exposed to the global audience as a man who weaponized his own charm to commit abuse. And thanks to the unwavering courage of women like Geena Davis, who refused to stay quiet any longer, that weapon has finally been permanently destroyed. We can no longer let a warm smile on a screen deceive us. Humor, when entirely stripped of empathy and respect, is not comedy. It is simply one of the most cruel, insidious forms of violence. For decades, the entertainment industry eagerly protected toxic behavior, hiding it behind the excuse of an artistic personality. But this monumental idol did not collapse because of one scandal. He fell because society evolved. We finally stopped accepting the destruction of human dignity in exchange for a punchline. Let this stand as a warning to the Hollywood elite. No amount of comedic genius can ever buy forgiveness for breaking the spirit of your colleagues. When the director yells cut, the cameras stop rolling. But the trauma for these actresses does not. What we have just seen is proof of a toxic power dynamic, where art becomes a shield for abuse, and silence is bought with fame. It is time for the truth to be heard. What are your thoughts on this dark reality? Leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to Actor Secrets as we continue to expose the dark side of Hollywood. Thanks for watching.